It's a quiet night. You're alone in your room. The kind of silence that feels thick, almost tangible, pressing against your ears. Outside, the wind whistles through the trees, and every little sound, the creak of a floorboard, the subtle hum of an appliance, the distant bark of a dog, suddenly feels like it's just for you. You tell yourself it's nothing. Just the house settling, just the night playing tricks. And yet, something in that quiet whispers differently. Something that makes your skin crawl even before you can see it. Tonight, you're not alone. Not really. Our first story begins in a small apartment complex in Chicago. Emma, a young woman in her mid-20s, lived on the top floor. One night, after a long day at work, she finally sank into her couch with a glass of wine and a book. The lights were dim, shadows dancing on the walls from the flickering candle she'd lit for ambience. Everything was normal, or at least it seemed normal. Around midnight, she heard it, a soft tapping at her front door. Not a knock, not the kind of polite interruption you could dismiss, but a slow, deliberate tap, tap, tap. She froze, heart thudding, and waited, listening for any movement outside. Silence. Perhaps it was a neighbor playing a prank. Emma shrugged it off, but a nagging unease crept under her skin. She went to the door, peeking through the peephole. Nothing. No one. The hallway was empty, dimly lit by the flickering emergency lights. She exhaled in relief and returned to the couch, but then it started again. Tap, tap, tap. Closer this time. Quicker. Louder. It was coming from the other side of the door. Closer. But how? Emma hadn't moved. She felt a cold sweat bead on her forehead as she realized something chilling. The tapping was now accompanied by a faint whispering, almost unintelligible, as if someone was speaking directly into her soul. Panicked, she grabbed her phone to call the front desk. No dial tone. Every app she tried failed to connect. Her blood ran cold. She glanced at the door again and noticed something she hadn't before. A shadow, long and thin, stretched along the hallway wall outside, moving independently of any light source. It didn't belong to anyone, and it certainly didn't belong there. The tapping increased, more frantic now, urgent. Emma's instincts screamed at her to run, but the front door was the only exit, and that shadow blocked her escape. She grabbed a kitchen knife, her last resort, and approached the door cautiously. "Who's there?" she demanded, voice shaking. Silence. Only the shadow. It lingered. She yanked open the door. Empty hallway. Nothing. The lights flickered, and she thought she saw movement in the corner of her eye. She turned sharply, knife raised, but again, nothing. Just the echo of her own rapid breathing, filling the empty apartment with a suffocating tension. Emma never forgot what happened next. As she turned to close the door, she saw faint scratches appearing on the wood itself, as if something unseen had clawed its way across the surface. They were slow, deliberate, forming shapes she didn't recognize, symbols almost, but unmistakably deliberate. Her hands shook violently. She backed away, knife ready, But the scratches continued, moving faster now, carving into the door in a rhythm that felt alive, intelligent. By the time she called the police, the marks had stopped. The officers found no one in the building. No forced entry. No evidence of anything abnormal. Just scratches, still fresh on her door, and a terrified young woman who couldn't sleep for weeks. That was just the beginning. Sometimes, it's not the presence you see that frightens you. It's the presence that watches from the shadows. The one that waits patiently, knowing you'll eventually notice it. Story 2 shifts to a rural setting in Oregon. Jake, an outdoorsman, often camped alone in the woods. One weekend, he drove deep into the mountains, far beyond cell service, seeking solitude. The first night, everything was perfect. A campfire, the sound of crickets, the stars blazing overhead. But as he drifted into sleep, he awoke to a subtle sound, footsteps circling his tent. Tent poles creaked, fabric shifted, but the footsteps were silent. Not even a twig snapped. Nothing typical for the woods at night. Something was moving just beyond his campfire's glow. Jake sat frozen, straining his ears. The steps stopped. Then came a low, guttural growl, as if something large and ancient was inspecting him, weighing him as prey. The growl echoed in the forest, bouncing off the trees. Impossible to pinpoint. Panic set in. But Jake knew running would be foolish. Whatever it was patient. He remembered the flashlight in his bag and shone it toward the perimeter of his tent. Nothing. Darkness swallowed the beam immediately, an unnatural black that seemed to absorb the light. Hours passed, or what felt like hours, before the growl disappeared. When dawn came, he emerged cautiously. Around his tent were strange markings etched into the dirt. Circles, symbols, scratches. Like a ritual had taken place around him while he slept. Nothing else was disturbed, but Jake never camped alone again. Something had watched him. Something had lingered, just out of sight, waiting for him to wake. The contrast is clear. In the city, it's shadows creeping in familiar spaces. In the woods, it's the dark itself, alive and patient. Both stories share a simple truth. Fear doesn't need to reveal itself fully to terrify. The mind fills in the gaps, and the imagination becomes the real monster. Next, we move to a suburban nightmare. One that hits closer to home for many. Claire lived in a quiet neighborhood. All lawns trimmed and houses painted perfectly. But when the sun went down, perfection shattered. One night, she heard her dog barking frantically at the living room window. The sound was insistent, angry, almost human. Claire checked outside. Nothing. The street was empty. Her neighbor's lights were out. No cars passed. Only the echoing bark of her dog, which now seemed fixated on something invisible. Claire tried to calm her pet, but then she noticed movement across the living room floor. Shadows, impossibly long, stretching across the walls and ceiling, contorting in unnatural ways. The air grew heavy, thick with an almost tangible malevolence. She backed away slowly, her eyes fixed on the movement. Something, a figure, indistinct but undeniably there, stood at the edge of the shadows. It didn't move like a person, didn't breathe like a person. It simply existed, watching, waiting, knowing. Time seemed to stretch, moments elongating unnaturally. Every instinct screamed at her to run. But the front door was now just another part of the nightmare. Shadows seemed to cling to her, pressing against her skin like cold, wet cloth. Claire grabbed her phone, emergency numbers typed, trembling fingers dialing. But the shadows twisted with her gaze, subtly reshaping the room. When her eyes darted away for a fraction of a second, the figure had moved closer. By morning, everything was normal again. The dog lay peacefully in the sun. No signs of entry, no furniture displaced. Yet Claire swore she felt eyes on her for weeks after. In every dark corner, every mirrored reflection, every shadow. Fear had left its mark, permanent and unyielding. These are the moments when horror thrives. In the alone at night terror, the subtle distortions, the things your mind insists aren't real, until you realize they might be. Fear doesn't always scream. Sometimes it whispers, crawls, and lingers. It's the quiet that terrifies the most. The second section plunges deeper into the terrifying reality of being alone at night. Fear thrives in silence, and nothing amplifies that fear more than a space that should feel safe, suddenly becoming alien. Our next story begins in a small, rural home in Pennsylvania, where Mark lived with his cat, Luna. Mark had always considered himself rational, dismissive of ghost stories and urban legends. That night, however, his skepticism would meet a stark challenge. Mark was reading in bed, the only sound the quiet hum of a small fan by his side. Around midnight, Luna, usually docile and curled in a corner, hissed and arched her back. Mark glanced toward her and froze. Across the room, a shadow moved. Not a shadow from the dim lamp he'd left on. This shadow was alive. It slithered along the walls, twisting unnaturally, avoiding the light. Mark blinked, thinking his eyes were deceiving him. But Luna continued to growl, ears pinned back, fur standing on end, refusing to leave her corner. The shadow moved again, this time rising slightly above the floor. And Mark realized with a cold jolt that it was tracking his movements. It mimicked his gestures in a distorted, delayed way, like a warped reflection, yet with a malevolent intelligence that no mirror could replicate. Panic surged, but Mark forced himself to breathe. Rationality demanded he understand it, name it, or at least define it. But no rational explanation existed. This was something else entirely. Something that felt older than the house, older than reason. He reached for the lamp, turning it fully on. The shadow vanished instantly, leaving nothing but the ordinary walls behind. He laughed nervously, blaming fatigue, stress, and imagination. But when he leaned back, the shadows at the edges of the room shifted again, slowly, deliberately, forming shapes too dark to exist naturally in lamplight. Mark's rational mind faltered. Something unseen was watching, moving just beyond the threshold of perception, waiting for him to let his guard down. By morning, Luna refused to enter the room, and Mark discovered scratches on the wooden floor. They were deep and irregular, like claws had dragged something across the boards, though his cat was the only living thing in the room. For days afterward, he felt it, a presence at night, lingering in the corners, patient, silent, mocking. Rationality, he realized, would not save him from being alone with this unseen watcher. The next story shifts to a more urban horror, something that can strike anywhere, even in modern apartments with security systems and neighbors close by. Sarah, a nurse working night shifts, returned to her downtown studio exhausted, expecting a quiet, safe haven. But as she entered, she noticed the front door slightly ajar. Confused, she swore she'd locked it, and she never left it unlocked. Her pulse quickened, and she held her keys like a weapon as she stepped inside. Nothing seemed missing. Nothing seemed moved. And yet, an oppressive heaviness clung to the air, a tension that made breathing feel laborious. Sarah turned toward her bedroom and froze. Across the floor, faint footprints stretched from the door to her bed. They weren't human exactly. Not the right size, not the right spacing, but they were unmistakably deliberate. Someone or something had entered while she slept, moving silently, watching, waiting. Her phone lay on the counter. She called the police immediately. Officers arrived within minutes, combing the apartment with flashlights. There was no sign of forced entry, no evidence of another person. Only the strange, irregular footprints remained, fading as if they were never fully there. Sarah spent that night on a friend's couch, never again returning alone after midnight. The presence lingered, invisible, patient, reminding her that safety is often an illusion. Contrast defines fear. In rural isolation, it's the darkness itself, bending, twisting, and alive. In urban environments, fear hides in the familiar. The apartment, the hallway, the room you know, but with subtle alterations that make everything feel wrong. Like the world has shifted imperceptibly while you slept. Our fourth story escalates into an almost surreal encounter. Alex, a college student in Boston, often stayed up late, working on assignments or browsing the internet. One night, around 2 a.m., he decided to grab a snack from the kitchen. Halfway down the hall, he froze. A figure stood at the far end, tall and thin, its face hidden beneath a hood, body perfectly still. Alex blinked. The figure did not move. He whispered, "Hello?" The figure tilted its head slightly, but no response came. Heart hammering, Alex backed into his room and locked the door. He tried to convince himself it was a hallucination. Fatigue from hours of staring at his laptop screen. But then came the sound of soft footsteps in his hallway. Slow, deliberate, circling his room. No creaking floorboards, no distinct rhythm. Just a faint, persistent movement, echoing as if time itself had warped to accommodate it. Alex stayed inside, breathing shallow, until sunrise. When he finally mustered the courage to peek outside, the hallway was empty, perfectly normal, as though nothing had happened. Yet, when he looked in the mirror, he noticed faint handprints in the condensation on the glass. Small, thin, impossibly high, like someone had pressed against the surface while unseen. Every night after, Alex felt watched. Small disturbances occurring in the shadows. Objects moved slightly. Whispers just below the threshold of hearing. The sensation of breath on his neck when he was alone. The psychological terror of these experiences is universal. The sense that someone or something is always present, always observing, always patient. Whether it's a shadow that moves independently, scratches appearing in the floor or door, or footsteps echoing in empty hallways. The horror is compounded by our isolation. Alone, the mind heightens every sound, every flicker of movement, every uncertainty. Alone, fear doesn't just enter the room. It lives there, breathing with you, waiting for you to relax. Our fifth story involves a family home. Yet, the terror strikes one person alone. Maria, living with her parents temporarily, stayed up late one night reading in the living room. Around midnight, she heard a soft giggle. Childlike, musical, and strangely familiar. She called out, "Mom! Dad!" Silence. The giggle returned, closer this time, echoing from the staircase leading to the basement. Maria's parents slept upstairs, doors closed. Gathering courage, she approached the stairs. A chill ran through her body. The basement door was ajar. A faint light flickered inside, though no bulbs were on. The giggle repeated, growing louder, taunting. Maria stepped back, heart racing, and ran to wake her parents. Together, they found nothing. No sign of intruder, no disturbance. But the giggling continued sporadically for months afterward, always at night, always when Maria was alone. Her parents heard nothing. No one else did. Just her. Even in shared spaces, being alone can be deadly, because fear doesn't require witnesses. It thrives on isolation, on the vulnerability that comes from being the only conscious observer. And sometimes, it chooses its victims deliberately, knowing they will feel helpless, their rational mind inadequate against the unseen. The sixth story takes us to a quiet suburban neighborhood in Oregon, where Thomas, a middle-aged man, lived alone after his children had moved out. He prided himself on routine. Lights off by 11 p.m., doors locked, alarms set. But one rainy evening, around 1:30 a.m., Thomas heard an unusual tapping at his front window. At first, he ignored it, attributing it to rain or tree branches. The tapping persisted, rhythmic and deliberate. Curiosity and unease battled inside him. Peering through the blinds, Thomas saw nothing. The yard was empty, drenched in rain, illuminated only by the dim glow of a street lamp. Yet, the tapping continued, now from the side of the house, then the back. Thomas's rational mind screamed coincidence, but his instincts screamed otherwise. Heart pounding, he checked every lock and bolt. Everything was secure. He tried to laugh it off, dismissing it as imagination, but a sense of being watched gnawed at him. Suddenly, his security camera pinged. Thomas rushed to check the live feed. The screen revealed a figure standing in the yard, pale, tall, with eyes glowing faintly in the darkness. It didn't move toward the camera, just stared. When Thomas blinked, it was gone. No shadow, no trace, nothing but the rain-soaked grass. The next morning, neighbors reported nothing unusual. Yet, that night and many nights afterward, tapping returned, following a pattern too precise to be random. The figure had never reappeared on the camera, but its presence lingered, silent, patient, terrifying. The seventh story is a tale of technology turning sinister. Emma, a young woman living in a small apartment in New York City, often relied on her smart home devices for convenience. Lights, locks, cameras, all automated. One evening, she went to bed, exhausted, leaving her smart speaker on the nightstand. Around 3 a.m., a soft voice whispered from it, "I see you." Emma jolted upright, convinced it was a glitch. She muttered, "Alexa, who's there?" The speaker responded in its usual monotone, "I'm right behind you." Emma froze, every muscle tense. She spun around. The room was empty. Rationality struggled to maintain dominance, but the fear gnawed relentlessly. She unplugged the speaker and crawled under her covers, heart racing. For weeks afterward, Emma avoided her apartment at night, too terrified to confront the lingering paranoia. Technology had become a medium for fear, blurring the line between the real and the unreal. And alone, at night, even familiar devices could betray trust, turning ordinary objects into instruments of terror. Contrast heightens fear, and the eighth story illustrates that vividly. In a small cabin in Vermont, Ian, a freelance writer, had retreated for solitude, seeking inspiration. The first night was peaceful. On the second, however, Ian heard whispers outside his cabin, soft, almost melodic, drifting through the forest. He ignored them, attributing them to wind or wildlife. But the whispers grew clearer, forming words he could almost understand. "Come out. Play with us." Ian's curiosity clashed with terror. Unable to resist, he peered outside, flashlight in hand. The forest was empty. The whispers ceased. Relieved, he returned inside, only to hear them from the ceiling, moving, circling, impossible. Every attempt to locate the source failed. Objects shifted subtly when he wasn't looking. Footsteps echoed where there were no paths. Ian spent sleepless nights listening, each whisper confirming he was not alone, that the forest, so serene by day, was alive with something ancient, something patient, and overwhelmingly intelligent. The ninth story is simple but profoundly unsettling. Daniel, a night shift security guard at an abandoned hospital, walked empty hallways with only his flashlight and the hum of the building's failing electricity. The hospital, long closed due to structural damage, had a reputation for hauntings. Daniel didn't believe in ghosts, yet that night he felt a presence. A sudden drop in temperature, shadows in corners, and a feeling of being followed. As he turned a corner, he glimpsed movement, a figure darting between rooms. Daniel pursued it, flashlight scanning the empty corridors. Nothing. Then came whispers, almost inaudible, trailing him, urging him to leave. Rational explanations faltered. Every hallway, every empty room became a theater of anticipation. Alone in darkness, the line between real and imagined blurred, until fear itself became a living, breathing entity, stalking him as surely as any predator. The 10th story brings us back to domestic horror, emphasizing how fear can infiltrate the familiar. Rachel, a single woman in Chicago, lived alone in a high-rise apartment. One night, while watching television, she noticed the reflection of a figure behind her in the glass window. A tall, featureless shadow. She turned quickly. The apartment was empty. Convinced it was a trick of the light, she resumed watching TV. But the reflection returned, closer, always behind her, lingering, watching. Rachel's anxiety escalated. She installed cameras, motion detectors, and even asked neighbors if they saw anyone suspicious. Nothing. Yet every night, the shadow appeared. Fleeting, ephemeral, a constant reminder that being alone can attract something that defies explanation. Eventually, Rachel moved, but the memory of that shadow and the feeling of eyes watching her every movement remained. Fear, she realized, was inescapable when it had a foothold in isolation. These stories share a common thread. The terror of being alone at night magnifies ordinary fears into extraordinary nightmares. Shadows twist into forms that stalk. Whispers seep through walls and technology, and the familiar becomes alien. Each tale contrasts ordinary environments, homes, apartments, forests, abandoned hospitals, with the extraordinary, unseen forces that prey on the solitary. The human mind, deprived of companionship, becomes the perfect hunting ground for fear, interpreting every sound, movement, or flicker of light as a potential threat. Alone, the night stretches endlessly, and the ordinary rules of the day, logic, safety, rationality, fail to protect. The mind left unchecked fills silence with whispers, shapes shadows into figures, and amplifies the smallest anomaly into an existential threat. Yet, even in the most terrifying circumstances, these stories also highlight resilience. Each protagonist faced the unknown, survived the night, and bore witness to the inexplicable. In that confrontation, fear becomes both a lesson and a haunting companion, a reminder that the darkness outside is only half of the danger. The other half lives within, fed by our own imagination and vulnerability. The 11th story, though not officially part of the 10, is a subtle reminder that fear often hides in plain sight. Marcus, a college student living alone in a cramped city apartment, returned home late one night after a long study session. Exhausted, he tossed his backpack on the couch and went straight to bed. At 2:47 a.m., his phone buzzed, a text from an unknown number. "You're not alone." Marcus froze. The number was local, untraceable. Panic set in as he searched his apartment, checking doors, windows, and closets. Everything seemed normal. The text was not a prank. It was calculated, unnervingly precise. Over the next hour, more messages arrived, each describing actions Marcus had taken. "You just turned off the light. You're holding your pillow tightly. You looked under the bed." The messages stopped as suddenly as they began, leaving Marcus shivering in the dark, unsure whether the intruder was physical, digital, or something else entirely. Contrast amplifies tension in the 12th story. Clara, a nurse working night shifts in a rural hospital, was walking back to her car in the hospital parking lot after a 12-hour shift. The lot was empty, lit only by a few flickering street lamps. A lone figure appeared near the exit, standing motionless. Facing her, Clara called out, but received no response. She started toward her car, but the figure moved in perfect sync with her, maintaining distance yet keeping pace. She ran. The figure ran. She reached her car, locking the doors behind her. But as she drove away, she glanced in the rearview mirror. The figure was nowhere to be seen, but her headlights had illuminated an impression in the lot. Footprints that were impossibly large, perfectly aligned, and not human. Clara never returned to that parking lot alone, and she still describes the feeling of being observed as something she cannot unsee, a haunting memory that thrives in the dark. The 13th story demonstrates how fear exploits routine. Oliver, a software engineer, was home alone on a stormy evening. Power outages were common in his area, but he relied on battery-powered lanterns for emergencies. As he worked, a knock came at the door. Hard, deliberate. He looked through the peephole. No one. Dismissing it as the storm, he returned to his desk. The knocking returned, louder, now accompanied by scraping, like nails across the wood. Oliver armed himself with a kitchen knife and approached the door. When he flung it open, the hallway was empty. Yet, on the floor, he found a single, wet handprint leading down the stairs, fading into darkness. Every shadow in his house seemed to move independently. Lights flickered, objects shifted subtly, and the storm outside was drowned out by a pounding sense of intrusion. Oliver survived the night, but the feeling of an unseen presence lingered, reminding him that even familiar spaces can harbor unknown horrors when one is alone. The 14th story is about auditory terror. Sophie, a teenager staying home alone while her parents visited relatives, fell asleep on the couch one winter night. Around midnight, the sound of footsteps echoed through the house. She assumed it was her cat, but she didn't own one. The footsteps grew louder, pacing back and forth in perfect rhythm. Sophie grabbed a baseball bat and crept upstairs, discovering nothing. The footsteps followed her, stopping whenever she stopped, resuming when she moved. It wasn't until morning, with sunlight filtering through the curtains, that the sounds vanished. Sophie's parents returned, puzzled at her shaken demeanor. No evidence of intruders existed, yet Sophie swore that something had been there, monitoring, testing boundaries, ensuring fear remained a constant companion through the night. The 15th story is perhaps the most psychologically disturbing. Alex, a freelance photographer, rented a remote cabin to focus on his work. The isolation was perfect. But one night, he noticed his photographs, taken during the day, appeared altered when he developed them on his laptop. Figures lurked in the background, faces partially obscured, eyes glowing faintly. Each photograph was identical in composition, yet the figures were new, never seen when the photos were originally taken. As nights passed, Alex began hearing whispers, soft, unintelligible, yet unmistakably human. Objects moved, lights flickered, and shadows stretched unnaturally across the walls. He attempted to leave, but found his car battery dead. Phone service non-existent. The cabin itself seemed alive, patient, a predator cloaked in the guise of isolation. The fear Alex experienced was compounded by the realization that he might never have been truly alone. Even during daylight hours, when rationality should have prevailed. The final story emphasizes that fear often originates from what is most familiar. Jenna, a young woman living alone in a historic townhouse, woke one night to the sound of someone humming softly in the dark. The voice was eerily familiar, imitating her mother's lullaby from childhood. Frozen, Jenna listened as the humming moved closer, pausing just outside her bedroom door. She called out, but there was no response. When she finally gathered courage to peek, the hallway was empty. The humming continued intermittently for weeks, always at night, always soft, a sinister parody of comfort. Jenna installed cameras and alarms, but the intruder if it was one, never appeared in footage. The townhouse, her home, had become a stage for fear, where shadows played tricks on the mind and isolation amplified terror. Even when surrounded by familiar walls, the unknown can infiltrate, reminding us that being alone at night is not just a physical condition. It is a state of vulnerability, exposing our deepest fears. As these stories demonstrate, being alone at night transforms ordinary experiences into arenas for the extraordinary. Doors that once provided safety become thresholds for the unknown. Shadows, whispers, and technological devices serve as conduits for fear. The contrast between day and night, between presence and absence, heightens tension, reminding us that human imagination, coupled with isolation, can be more terrifying than any visible threat. In each tale, survival is uncertain. The protagonists face unseen forces, unexplained phenomena, and relentless psychological pressure. Yet their endurance provides insight into human resilience, how fear can be confronted, how rationality can attempt to reclaim control, and how the experience of terror becomes a lasting narrative. Alone at night, the mind's eye sharpens, perceiving patterns and presences that daylight might dismiss. This heightened perception, while adaptive, leaves individuals vulnerable to terror, both real and imagined, crafting memories that linger long after the night has ended. So, the next time you find yourself alone at night, consider these stories. The creak of a floorboard, the whisper of the wind, the flicker of a shadow. These are not always harmless. They may be the subtle signs of forces beyond understanding, or they may be fear itself, amplified and personalized by solitude. Either way, the night holds a power that the day cannot replicate, a power that reminds us why the human mind, when left alone in darkness, becomes both hunter and hunted, observer and prey, witness to truths we may never fully comprehend.